They tore down my bridge while I was in town buying feed. Not because it was falling apart, not because it was unsafe, but because somebody in a polished SUV decided I was an inconvenience. And inconveniences in their world get erased. When I got back and saw nothing but a 20-foot drop where steel used to be, I didn't yell. I didn't curse. I just sat there with the engine running, staring at empty air, realizing someone thought I'd fold if they cut off my only way home. What they didn't understand is simple land remembers, and paperwork lasts longer than money. I own 43 acres out past Red Hollow Canyon, about 20 minutes outside of town. Most people only drive through on their way to somewhere shinier. It's not postcard pretty. It's red dirt that stains your boots, juniper trees that lean like old men in the wind, a creek that runs hard in spring and disappears into cracked stone by August. It's quiet out there, the kind of quiet where you can hear coyotes argue at night and your own thoughts get louder than you'd like. When I bought it back in 2002, folks said I'd lost my mind. No paved road, no utilities unless you drag them in yourself, and one tight pinch in the canyon where the only sensible crossing was a bridge. So I built one, not some backyard lumber experiment either. I hired an engineer out of Flagstaff, pulled county permits. Steel I-beams fabricated by a shop that usually handles municipal work. Guardrails reinforced decking load rating higher than anything I'd ever drive across it. The inspector signed off twice. It cost more than my cabin that first year, but I didn't want to depend on anybody for access to my own land. The bridge sat partly on my parcel and partly on what was at the time a big undeveloped ranch next door. Back in 1986, long before me, an access easement had been recorded when the canyon properties were subdivided. Clean language, perpetual, runs with the land, cannot just vanish because someone new shows up with deeper pockets. For nearly 20 years, life was steady. I did consulting work remotely, leased a patch for winter grazing, kept to myself. My nearest neighbor back then, old Carl, used to joke the only traffic jam we'd ever see would involve deer. Then Carl passed and his kids sold 200 acres to a development group called High Mesa Horizons. Slick name, glossy website, drone shots at sunset, words like immersive wilderness retreat and curated solitude. You know, the type curated solitude, like they could package quiet and sell it by the night. Their development director was a man named Nolan Pierce. First time he pulled up, his SUV looked allergic to dust. Boots without a scratch, smile-polished eyes calculating. "Mr. Walker," he said, shaking my hand like we were already negotiating something. "As long as you respect the land and the easements," I told him, "we'll get along fine." He paused just a little too long at that word, easements. A week later, I caught him standing on my bridge with a surveyor, measuring, photographing, whispering. "Assessing existing structures," he said casually when I asked. "For what?" "Liability. If we're bringing guests in, we have to ensure safety." That was the first flicker, not fear exactly, but that sense you get when someone's mentally rearranging your life on a blueprint. 2 weeks after that, I drove into town for supplies. 4 hours, maybe. When I came back, something felt wrong before my brain caught up to it. The bridge was gone. Steel cut clean, excavator parked like it owned the place. My guardrails stacked on a flatbed like scrap. I walked toward the operator. "Who told you to do this?" "Just following work orders, sir," he muttered. "Structure deemed unsafe." "Unsafe." I called Nolan. "Our consultants determined it posed a liability risk," he said smoothly. "We can't have substandard infrastructure adjacent to a high-end experience." "Adjacent," I said. "That's my legal access. You're welcome to construct a new crossing that aligns with our master plan." That's when I understood this wasn't safety. It was leverage. Without that bridge, my only alternative was a miserable 15-mile detour through washed-out fire roads. Barely passable dry, impossible after rain. They thought inconvenience would wear me down, that I'd sell, that they'd fold my acreage into their resort footprint and market it as expanded privacy. "Put it back," I told him. "That's not going to happen," he said, and hung up. I've never been the sue first type. I prefer handshakes to courtrooms. But this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was calculated. So I drove back into town, that forced detour burning gas and patience, and walked straight into the office of Eleanor Grant. Eleanor had practiced property law in this county longer than High Mesa Horizons had existed as a company. She adjusted her glasses, studied the photos of cut steel, and said calmly, "They didn't just trespass, Daniel. They interfered with a recorded access easement. That's catastrophic." Catastrophic. Not dramatic, not emotional, just factual like gravity. We filed for emergency injunctive relief that night. The next morning, we stood in front of a judge in a modest courthouse with fluorescent lights and wooden benches worn smooth by decades of nervous hands. Nolan showed up flanked by attorneys in tailored suits. He gave me a tight smile. Eleanor didn't grandstand. She walked through the fax-recorded easement-permitted bridge. No safety citations, active demolition photos. Nolan's attorney tried the safety angle. The judge flipped through the documents. Was it removed with a court order? No, Your Honor. Then I'm issuing a temporary restraining order. Restore access within 72 hours. Just like that. Outside the courtroom, Nolan caught up with me. This didn't have to escalate, he said. You escalated it when you brought a torch, I replied. 72 hours passed. Nothing. No crews, no materials. Eleanor filed for contempt. Back in court, the judge's patience was thinner. Then Eleanor did something I didn't see coming. She requested a temporary freeze on their active construction permits until compliance was verified. Nolan's head snapped toward her. Granted, that single word hit harder than any argument. Over the next week, inspectors swarmed their property. And here's the twist. Once scrutiny starts, it doesn't stop at one beam of steel. Their site plan labeled my bridge as future guest overflow parking. Their water rights barely mentioned the seasonal creek feeding a protected watershed. Septic layout exceeded soil limits in multiple zones. Fire access roads 2 feet narrower than code required. Individually fixable. Together, a pattern. Red tags appeared at their entrance. Work suspended. Permit under review. Nolan called me one evening. You're weaponizing bureaucracy, he said. No, I told him quietly. I'm enforcing the same rules you ignored. By month 3, investors were nervous. By month 5, subcontractors were backing out. By month 8, High Mesa Horizons filed for Chapter 11. They rebuilt my bridge exactly as it had been, beam for beam. I didn't celebrate with champagne. I stood in the middle of that steel span at sunset and listened to the wind move through the canyon, realizing something uncomfortable. Power assumes compliance. It assumes smaller players will fold. And sometimes it's not strength that stops it, it's documentation. But here's the part people don't talk about. When the resort collapsed, town opinions split. At Miller's Hardware, conversations stopped when I walked in. Shame, someone muttered. Would have brought money. And I get that. Jobs matter. Growth matters. A week later, Nolan showed up at my gate. No polished SUV this time. Old pickup, no sunglasses. You could have sold, he said. Not accusatory, just tired. Maybe I said. But that's not what this was about. You were a gap, he admitted quietly. The footprint needed to be cohesive. A gap, like I was negative space on a blueprint. You ever consider the gap, might be the point I asked. He didn't answer. Over the next year, the property sold again, this time to a conservation group out of Santa Fe. Smaller project. Strict environmental review. They came to my kitchen table first. Asked about the easement. About runoff patterns. About fire access. It felt different. Collaborative instead of territorial. And yeah, some folks called me a hypocrite when I supported that scaled-down plan. You killed the first resort, Pete said outside the diner. Now you're backing this one. I didn't kill anything, I told him. I enforced the rules. Growth isn't the enemy. Arrogance is. There were nights during that fight when legal bills stacked up and I wondered if I'd overplayed it. Could have taken the payout, could have moved somewhere easier. But then I'd picture that empty canyon span, the assumption baked into that decision that my access could be erased without a conversation, and I'd feel steady again. And the bridge still stands. I drive across it almost daily. Sometimes I stop halfway and look down at the creek bed, dry most of the year, rushing hard in spring. Pressure builds quietly, until it doesn't. Do I feel bad? High Mesa collapsed. I feel bad for subcontractors who got squeezed, for workers who expected steady jobs. But I don't feel bad for defending what was legally mine. If Nolan had knocked on my door that first day and said, what would it take? Maybe we'd have had a different story. Maybe I would have sold, maybe not. But we would have started with respect. Instead, they started with a torch. So here's what I'm honestly curious about. If you were in my boots, staring at empty air where your only bridge used to be, would you have fought or taken the money and stepped aside for development? And if you were Nolan under investor pressure and deadlines, would you have gambled on removing the obstacle first and sorting out consequences later? Where's the line between ambition and overreach? Between protecting your property and holding back opportunity? I still live out here. Still value the quiet. Still believe land isn't just a line item on a balance sheet. And sometimes the only thing that slows fast-moving power down is someone willing to stand in the gap and say, no, not like that. So tell me, was this just a stubbornness, something in between? Drop your thoughts below. I genuinely want to hear where you land. Because out here in Red Hollow, the bridge is still standing. And not every story about power ends that way.